Global Justice explores whether our moral obligations actually stop at our borders, and mastering it is absolutely essential to understanding how international law tackles everything from extreme poverty to climate change. Hi, I'm your host, and I am so thrilled to welcome you to this explainer. We're going to break down the foundational theories and the most pressing modern challenges of international law. We'll build your understanding step by step so you walk away with a really complete, rigorous grasp of the whole field. Okay, let's dive into this.
Here's exactly where we're heading today. First up, we'll chart the history of global justice, moving chronologically through the major thinkers. Second, we'll break down the 9 central challenges defining international law today. Third, we'll apply these theories to a concrete, real-world case study, sea level rise. And finally, we'll wrap up with a structured course recap to make sure all of this sticks.
Section 1, History of Global Justice, from domestic to global theory. You know, for centuries, brilliant philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau thought of justice almost entirely as a domestic issue, something that happened strictly inside a state, not between them.
Let's move to our timeline and see how this builds. If we trace these ideas chronologically, we see fairness slowly migrate from happening inside a country's borders out into global treaties, then to hypothetical academic theories, and finally, directly clashing with concrete economic realities. Looking at the pre-20th century, Immanuel Kant was the big exception to that domestic focus with his 1795 essay Perpetual Peace. Then, skipping ahead to post-World War II, the UN Charter in 1945 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 were really the first institutional assertions that justice crosses borders. In the 1970s, John Rawls reignited justice theory domestically in 1971. But by 1979, Charles Beats and Thomas Pogge extended Rawls's framework globally, which pretty much birthed global justice as an academic subfield. In the 90s and 2000s, economic globalization through institutions like the World Trade Organization in 1995 made all this a hard reality. Rawls responded cautiously with his 1999 work, The Law of Peoples, and finally, in 2009, Amartya Sen's The Idea of Justice shifted the debate entirely, moving away from designing perfect global systems toward actually reducing identifiable injustice.
To really understand the origins, though, we have to look closely at Kant. In plain language, Kant basically suggested that no matter where you go on Earth, you deserve basic respect simply as a human being. It's kind of like a universal passport for basic human dignity. To give you the precise rule, Kant's cosmopolitan right, proposed in 1795, outlined a universal right of hospitality and a federation of free states. It stands as arguably the very first serious assertion of legal justice transcending borders.
And that brings us to Section 2, the 9 central challenges, or the friction points of international law. Now, take a deep breath here, because precision is key. These 9 doctrines form the absolute bedrock of international legal disputes today, and we're going to tackle them step by step.
The first 3 challenges deal with the basic structure of our world. Challenge 1 is sovereignty. Imagine a landlord trying to enforce rules in an apartment building they don't actually own. The precise rule here is the sovereignty challenge. How do you enforce justice claims across formally equal sovereign states when there's absolutely no world government above them? Challenge 2 is the scope or boundary problem, which we'll look at closely in just a second. And challenge 3 is the agency problem. Think of a messy office break room where, everyone is supposed to clean up, which means nobody actually does. The precise rule for the agency problem is that diffuse global obligations without a clear designated duty bearer simply go unenforced. If a global justice principle is theoretically sound, who specifically bears the duty to act?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we break down that second challenge, the scope and boundary problem. Think about helping a neighbor right next door versus helping a total stranger on the other side of town. Do you owe them the exact same effort? The rule here is a clash of 2 theories. On the left, nationalist theorists, like David Miller, defend the idea that we have a stronger moral duty to our compatriots, our fellow citizens. On the right, cosmopolitan theory rejects that distinction entirely. They argue that national borders are morally arbitrary and shouldn't dictate who gets justice. Challenge 4 tackles global economic inequality. In plain language, is extreme poverty caused by bad local leaders or by a totally unfair global economic game? Imagine a boat that's sinking because it's full of leaks, versus a race car driving on a track that is secretly rigged to make it crash. The rule here is the debate between internal and external factors. The internal governance theory blames corruption and poor domestic policy.
But the external structure theory, famously championed by Thomas Page, argues poverty is primarily caused by a shared institutional scheme of rigged global trade and finance that actively disadvantages poorer nations. Let's group three massive systemic challenges together next. Challenge 6 is the global governance deficit. Imagine a homeowners association with 100 houses, but only 5 people ever get to vote. The legal reality is that bodies like the UN Security Council, the IMF, and the World Bank are widely criticized as unrepresentative, dominated by powerful states, and lacking direct accountability to the people most affected by their decisions. Challenge 8 is intergenerational justice. Think of this like maxing out a credit card in your unborn grandchild's name. The precise rule here is the immense difficulty of weighing present interests against the rights of future generations who have absolutely no seat at today's decision-making tables. And then there is Challenge 5, climate burden sharing.
To understand climate burden sharing, imagine a massive, incredibly expensive dinner feast. You arrive late, barely eat a single bite, but you're handed an equal share of the enormous bill. The rule here is the intense legal and moral tension between historical high emitters, mostly developed states who industrialized early, and current or future emitters in developing states. This tension is the absolute core of the ongoing international debates over loss and damage finance.
So the crucial point is how international law actually attempts to resolve that dinner bill analogy. It uses a very specific legal doctrine. Please make sure to note this precise term. Common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR. This is the legal principle stating that all states share a common obligation to address environmental destruction, but they bear differentiated, unequal burdens based on their historical contribution to the problem and their current financial capabilities.
Moving on, Challenge 7 deals with migration. Think of the difference between a gated private community and an open public park. The rule here is the friction between two competing legal claims. On one hand, a state claims the sovereign right to control its borders and immigration. On the other, we have the cosmopolitan claim to universal freedom of movement and the human right to seek asylum.
Our final challenge, number 9, is the justice of intervention. Imagine you hear a violent assault happening inside your neighbor's house. At what point are you legally and morally justified in breaking down their locked door? The precise legal rule here is the responsibility to protect, or R2P. This doctrine dictates exactly when severe injustice and human rights abuses abroad justify humanitarian intervention, effectively overriding a state's sovereign borders.
That takes us into Section 3, our case study on sea level rise. We are moving from theory into stark reality here. This real-world example gives you the cleanest, most devastating illustration of nearly every single challenge we just covered, all happening at exactly the same time.
And this brilliantly illustrates the friction of international law. Let's walk through the Pacific Islands dilemma methodically. Imagine being evicted from your family home because your neighbor deliberately flooded your foundation, and then, because you no longer have a physical address, the government deletes your legal identity entirely. Here are the facts. Pacific's small island developing states contribute minimally to global emissions, yet climate change is literally submerging their physical territory. The legal issue is that under a strict reading of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a nation's maritime baselines are tied to its actual physical coastline. If that coastline disappears underwater, the rules suggest they lose their maritime zones, their fishing rights, and potentially their very legal existence as a state.
The holding, or at least the fierce legal pushback to this, came in the 2021 Pacific Islands Forum Declaration. It explicitly states, maritime zones, once established under UN clause, should be preserved regardless of physical coastline change caused by climate change. Why does this matter? Well, because it's a direct global justice claim pushing back against the strict letter of an existing treaty. They're basically asserting that the states least responsible for a global harm absolutely should not suffer legal erasure because of it.
And hey, this isn't just some hypothetical academic debate. The International Law Commission, or the ILC, has taken this up as a standing item of study right now. It is a live, highly contentious, and totally unresolved dispute between the rigid mechanics of treaty law and the moral demands of global justice.
Wow, we have covered immense ground today. Now, for Section 4, we're going to do a structured, comprehensive recap. I want you to review your notes as we go through this in exact teaching order, just so these concepts are permanently locked in. First up, our theorists. We started back in 1795 with Kant's cosmopolitan right, that universal passport of human dignity.
We saw how Rawls reignited domestic justice. We learned how Beetz and Thomas Pogge globalized it, with Pogge pointing out the shared institutional scheme of external economic structures. We looked at Amartya Sen's very practical shift toward reducing identifiable injustice. And we explored the scope and boundary problem through David Miller's nationalist theory, prioritizing compatriots, versus the cosmopolitan view that borders are morally arbitrary.
Next, the key doctrines and legal flashpoints. We covered the sovereignty challenge of enforcing rules without a world government. We unpacked the agency problem of diffuse duties lacking a clear duty bearer. We learned the precise rule of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities for sharing the climate burden. We covered R2P, the responsibility to protect, dictating when humanitarian intervention is justified. And finally, we saw all of this collide in the UN-Klaus maritime baseline dispute, where Pacific small island developing states literally face legal erasure due to sea level rise.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question. If the strict letter of international law leads to the legal erasure of the nations least responsible for climate change, does the law actually serve justice, or does it merely protect the powerful? Think about the challenge of intergenerational justice here, how our actions today bind the future forever. You now have the precise legal framework to analyze these massive, unfolding crises for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.